This Sunday marks a number of moments and concerns in the church's life, and therefore it's one of the least favorite Sundays that I have for preaching in trying to tie it all together. I think you're probably used to the bologna sandwich by now, but some Sundays you kind of get a Dagwood sandwich, and that's what today feels like. Well, the first concern is that this moment is also known as Christ the King Sunday. If you're like me, you probably grew up in the church and went to Sunday school and the youth group and then worshiped many Sundays as someone sitting in the pew. So if that general description describes you, then it's quite possible that you did not hear of Christ the King Sunday until much later in your church life. It started with the Roman Catholic Church in 1925, but eventually was introduced primarily through the adoption of the common or ecumenical lectionaries in the early 1970s by the rest of us. Well, the actual choice of which Sunday changed over the years as well, until it was finally settled that it would be the Sunday that marks the end of the Christian or liturgical year. That is, the last Sunday before Advent, which begins the new year. So, Happy New Year. That's the second part of the sandwich. So Happy New Year. This is the end of the Christian year. That's why it's now the choice for Christ the King Sunday. It's the time when we emphasize the true kingship of Christ. Christ is ruler of the world and head of God's kingdom on earth. Crown him with many crowns, reads one of our several Christ the King hymns. Well, you don't have to search very far before you can drive through the communities and find buildings today dedicated to Christ the King as well. So in our time, we struggle with words such as king, kingdom, and even Lord as terms not being appropriate in a world that has been dominated by males and male imagery for far too long. In fact, such titles may even threaten or oppress some people, many of whom are the very people we believe Jesus would want to embrace and love and serve. We need to acknowledge that our human language reflects the good and the bad of our world, and that our language will always be inadequate when we wish to acknowledge God made known to us in many forms and through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It is this continuing revelation that we mark today as we come to the end of yet one more church year. We've come full circle through the time of waiting, the birth, the baptism, the ministry, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the gift of Pentecost, which we've been following for nearly the last half year. Well, the result is our affirmation, or really reaffirmation, that this is the one God, and that Jesus is God's Messiah, and that God's Spirit guides us on our journey of life together. However we name it, this is the day that is the exclamation mark of our faith. Life continues, and therefore our faith journey continues with a new year beginning next Sunday. But for today, this brief moment, we acknowledge with clarity of purpose that God, the Creator, is in charge of creation, and we need not fear. That is the message that Isaiah had for King Hezekiah and the Jewish people. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of the bullies and the tyrants of your world. Any threat they appear to have will be short-lived in the fullness of God's time. It's quite amazing what people will endure over the short term in order to realize something so much better in the long term. The people of Ukraine are perfect illustrations at the moment, but they're not alone in this world where wars and tyrannical bullies dominate in so many nations and communities. When people believe that better is possible, then they find a depth of resolve that is biblical in perspective. Their lives may not be saved as simply as having the tyrant go home and commit suicide. Our passage says he was felled by the sword. But tyrants do not win. Tyrants cannot win when the oppressed insist on a more compelling view of God's realm as a place of peace. Our reading today concludes with chapter 2, which is found in parallel in Micah chapter 4, in which the future house of God is seen as a place where all people might gather, a place where differences may be arbitrated, resolved, and where the people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Walter Brueggemann suggests the vision speaks of a deep alternative to what is. They shall not learn war, but they shall work together to see that all the people are fed through their labors with plows and pruning hooks. Rather than ripping up creation in battle, they shall open up creation to plant seed, to grow, to care for, and to support people and their needs, whatever those needs might be. Today is also known in some churches as Trans Sunday, a day when we recognize and celebrate at the conclusion of Trans Week people who identify as transsexual. As with Christ the King Sunday, we know that it is a Sunday of mixed achievements, and that it's not the ending of the journey, but the beginning of the continuing journey. Earlier this autumn, multimedia artist Casilles created a new dance called Human Measure, in which through dance, the reality of being trans was brought to light. This is at a time when trans people are more visible than ever, yet in some jurisdictions, the reality is that their rights are being rolled back at unprecedented rates throughout the world. The dance raises the question, does visibility necessarily equate to civil rights? Well, dancer Casilles states that is not the case in terms of a lived experience, and notes as a trans person living in the United States, quote, "We're in a moment of increased violence in a society which is actively passing legislation that is trying to erase the very existence of your being." Visibility does not equate to civil rights. On the one hand, we celebrate the higher visibility of trans people and value the gifts they bring to our culture, while on the other hand, the civil rights we enjoy are denied and taken away from many trans people. In Canada, Faye Johnstone, an advocate for LGBTQ rights, speaks from their own experience as a transgender woman, noting that while we've managed to get the legislative rights largely correct in Canada, we too still have a long way to go in terms of lived experiences. Experiences such as finding equal access to employment and equal access to health care are two examples cited in the Toronto Star interview. There are no easy answers to questions raised by Casilles and Johnstone's lived experience and the experience of so many other trans people in essentially every sector of society. Professor Amy Oden notes that there are many voices in the world eager to convince. Be afraid, be very afraid. Fear-mongering is an extremely profitable business. Fear can motivate people to spend money on things they don't need, to get out and to vote, or to lash out to faceless others called immigrants or Muslims or trans or fill in the blank. Fear can cause adults to overwork and kids to overperform. Fear can create bonds of unity that feel really great, us against them. Tyrants have known for millennia that if you want to control people, make them afraid. Fear is the strongest motivation humans know, except for love. And whether it is the people of Israel in the 8th century BC, the church throughout its history, wars anywhere such as that in the Ukraine today, the discernment around the future of Windermere, or the struggle for trans people as one of many groups struggling for their rights in place, the one thing I believe that we can have in common is the belief that our God is a God of love, and that in and through Jesus Christ, God's new realm has been introduced not as a finished project, but as a promised outcome in this world of challenges and uncertainties. That is what Brueggemann calls the deep alternative. I do not think it's simplistic to remember the words of Isaiah, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid as we struggle with the realities of life and somehow work to take instruments that would deny life and turn them into instruments that produce life. Professor Juliana Claessens of Stellenbosch University in South Africa has a commentary on our passages for today. Amidst the context of war, domination, and force that governs the narrative account in Isaiah 36 and 37, the words of Isaiah 2 holds up an alternative view. God is no longer the mighty warrior who will fight the other nations, but rather God is the great teacher of God's ways, the righteous judge and the arbitrator between nations. By bringing these texts from the book of Isaiah together, the lectionary seems to suggest that it is this vision of God that may be behind the prophet's words to Hezekiah's officials to go share with the fearful and despondent king. Do not be afraid because of all the words that you've heard. In the vision of Isaiah 2, God is held up as a God who seeks peace and justice, who instead of teaching nations how to make war, teaches them how to live together, how to share resources, how to find nonviolent solutions in order to arbitrate disputes. The purpose of these lessons in peacemaking and peacekeeping is that everyone may live well. And so it will be on that day when the last sword becomes a plowshare. That has been the dream of God's people for nearly 3,000 years. And so it remains for us on this Sunday of Sundays. Amen.